If corrective action isn't taken, the MAGA movement will reclaim the American presidency in the coming years and do irreparable damage to our democracy. I would know. I was once on the inside of it, naively hoping Trump would rise to the moment or that grown-ups would ameliorate the fanaticism of his movement. Folks, those are the words of my guest today on the Michael Steele podcast, none other than Miles Taylor. He's a national security expert who previously served as chief of staff at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And in 2018, he published an anonymous essay in the New York Times blowing the whistle on presidential misconduct, bad behavior, and just god-awful policy. His new book, Blowback, A Warning to Save Democracy from the Next Trump, is out now, and we get into the blowback of the Trump administration and what lies ahead. Hey, everybody, welcome to the Michael Steele podcast. Well, we got a good one for you today. I'm excited to have my boy in the house with us. I'm excited to have Miles Taylor, who's joining us. He's in the house to talk about all the blowback that he gets. See what I did there? But we're also going to talk about his new book, which is out, talking about and providing an important warning to save democracy from the next Trump. What's up, Miles? How you doing, baby?
Michael, Governor, great to be with you, Chairman. You know, Your Honor. You know what? I call you everything. It's great to be back with you. Happy to join, and I think we probably should do a trigger warning before these episodes. That we're probably going to say things that piss people off, and it may be language that's you wouldn't want your kids listening to. So we'll keep it classy, but maybe salty.
So here we are in the middle of the summer. We're in the middle of July. Your blowback is out, and in the last few days. And how do you feel about this story? I mean, I think in one sense, I want to start at the beginning with Anonymous, which really kind of was a triggering moment, not just for the country, but for you personally, which you kind of open up blowback with, sort of saying that this environment really was cathartic for you and important for you. And now that leads you to write the next chapter about Trump 2.0. But let's set the stage first with Anonymous, because I think it's important to understand, as a former member of the administration, someone who's in the inside, someone who saw this firsthand, you had reached that point where your duty and your conscience were coming into conflict. And you'd made the very difficult decision to blow the whistle on what you were seeing and hearing and what was happening inside the administration, and paid a price for that in many, many ways, and still do to this day. How does that story set up this story for you?
Well, it was sort of unexpected, Michael, in the sense that, frankly, I didn't realize how deep, and not to take it straight into, real territory, but I didn't realize how emotionally and physically I would be affected by the whole experience of whistleblowing. And at the same time as this book's coming out, I've agreed to do a podcast that's coming out with iHeartRadio called The Whistleblowers, where we've interviewed a lot of people who've gone and blown the whistle on public corruption. And there's a common theme here where a lot of folks go try to do it for the right reasons. They want to shine a light on corruption, and they just do not expect the aftermath and how it will affect their lives. So this book actually started, in a sense, on election night 2020. I was holed up in a safe house, alone, armed, with a bodyguard on the street because of all the death threats I'd been receiving for unmasking myself as a longtime Trump critic, at the time known as Anonymous. And I'll get into that in a second. And that night, that election night, as you remember, things weren't breaking well
Right.
things were actually breaking pretty badly if you were watching it. Namely, a number of the states that had been forecast to easily go for Joe Biden actually started to go for and ultimately were called for Trump. And so Biden's path to victory was looking narrower and narrower. And I'm watching this and realizing I've detonated my entire life to go against this guy, sitting in this drab safe house. And then it looks like, and it may have been for naught. And I was in a pretty dark place about it. After Biden ultimately won, I started to reflect and ask the question, what would have happened if Donald Trump won a second term? And more broadly, what will happen if a similar MAGA figure wins the White House? And who cares what Miles Taylor has to say? Very specifically, what do people across other departments and agencies forecast will happen? People who'd been in those chairs, people who knew what was going to happen in the Pentagon and Homeland Security and the White House, what do they say will happen in the second term? And I wanted to write that story. But as to write that story, you mentioned the word catharsis. I needed to spend a little time reflecting on what I put myself through. And I talk a little bit about that in the book. And most specifically, in September of 2018, I wrote an anonymous opinion piece from within the Trump administration to say publicly what all of Trump's advisors were saying privately. Now, it's not something that I think, should have had to have been done. In fact, my frustration was a lot of these administration officials I was serving with weren't saying the truth out loud, which is that the majority of the president's cabinet felt like he was unfit for office at best and dangerously unstable at worst. It's one thing to criticize your boss. It's another thing to think that he's a threat to the fabric of the republic. But people weren't saying that, so I felt like it needed to be said.
You noted in the prologue of the book very early on, quote, "At first, withholding my identity seemed to work. Without a scapegoat, the president was powerless in countering the narrative that his own people thought he was incompetent." The essay, which you had submitted to the New York Times, entitled "I Am Part of the Resistance Inside the Trump Administration," led to a cascade of questions about his stability, new revelations, and a pressing national conversation. He launched a manhunt for the author. And then, of course, you're watching his Twitter feed and words like treason are popping up. And then I think as you go on to detail what those moments, subsequent moments were like, you began to realize that, maybe this was a dangerous move. What if they find out who this is? What happens to me and my family and so forth? How chilling of an effect did that have on subsequent actions that you may have taken or otherwise could have taken on the heels of your essay?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, Michael, it kept me in the closet, so to speak. Frankly, it terrified me about coming forward because the anonymous visage and the concept of this imaginary person in the administration became so big, so larger than life. Some people thought it was a resistance superhero. Some people thought it was a treasonous villain, like Trump said, that it made it a lot harder for me to muster up the courage to come out. And I try to be as blunt about that as possible in this book. I was scared shitless to do this at a point because it was clear that when I did, it would detonate my life. Mm-hmm. And I really dragged my feet in doing it. I mean, going way back in time, I went into the Trump administration very clear-eyed. There was no mistaking that this guy was a pretty dangerous figure. I had no desire to go into a Trump White House. And in fact, initially, had worked with Paul Ryan to try to thwart Trump's rise. Clearly, we failed. A lot of us failed miserably in that effort. We were working on something called the Trump inoculation plan. No one really knows about it because we weren't successful in inoculating the GOP against Trump. But once he won, when mentors of mine like John Kelly went into the administration, it was clear that they needed folks to come in and steady the ship. And I was one of the really strong believers in this notion of an axis of adults. In fact, very early in the administration, I gave that quote to Kim Dozier, who was then a reporter at the Daily Beast. I said, we've got an axis of adults in the administration, and they're keeping it steady. And, I came to repudiate that viewpoint because as time went on, as much as people tried to keep the president in check, like John Kelly and Jim Mattis and Rex Tillerson, it was clear that Trump was just going to systematically pick them off. And that's where I felt like it was important to speak out, is this idea of unelected bureaucrats keeping the country safe from Trump was a false one. And so I wrestled with the idea of unmasking myself. If I have one regret about it, Michael, it's that I didn't do it sooner, because what I came to find after I came forward in 2020 and started campaigning against Trump and recruiting other people to come forward, the dozens of folks I tried to get to come forward sooner, a year prior, they wouldn't do it because there was no air cover. There was not anyone out there already. And I realized, shit, I should have done this 2 years ago to show that the water's warm, there's air cover, more people can leave the administration and oppose him. We're lucky in part because of efforts of people like you. You were out there actively recruiting these people from the Trump administration saying, you can come out against him, it'll be okay. But I regret not coming out sooner because I think I could have provided more air cover.
The strategist in me, when I look back on that, in reading the New York Times piece, what I loved about the position you were in on that is no one would ever have thought it was a Miles Taylor. Everyone would have thought it was a cabinet secretary, and they did. It was a cabinet secretary. I mean, some even floated it was the White House chief of staff. There were all these other people. No one would have thought there was a guy in the administration just doing his job in some very powerful rooms, watching the nation systematically break down, watching the process systematically break down around an individual who was no longer president, but emerging into something much more dangerous and difficult. And so you got to watch and see the factionalization of the GOP, that rational faction come up against the sort of irrational faction or the sort of MAGA faction and get its ass kicked, and then be compelled to sort of historically mark the moment. So to your point, the strategy for me in that position would have been, after that story had hit, I probably would have revealed myself for that purpose. And the larger purpose, honestly enough, would have been to shame all the assholes who were light year and grades above me, who were sitting there bitching in those very same rooms after the president left about the meeting they just had, and then publicly going out reinforcing that bullshit or not saying anything at all. So I can see and appreciate how you're kind of caught in that moment where you do the essay and you're like, okay, maybe they'll get it. And now maybe some folks will say something. But then all of a sudden you're 6 months down the road, 8 months down the road, and you realize they're not going to do it. They're just not going to do it. That kind of sets up this moment that we're in now. I mean, when I think about someone like Chris Christie, who is actively now campaigning against Donald Trump versus what he was doing for Donald Trump in 2020, and even before that, how do you see these storylines reshaping not just the presidential race, but the opportunity to set in motion the defeat of MAGA republicanism?
I think it's going to be hard, but you point to exactly the right time period, because my personal decision-making on this, I think, parallels the moral decision-making that people in the party are going to have to make today. And, after I'd released that op-ed, and I invite people to scrutinize my decisions, because it was a moral choose-your-own adventure, or rather a moral choose-your-own nightmare, if you will. The op-ed drops. I say, there's an axis of adults in the administration. They think the president's crazy. They're trying to keep him in check. I should have left the administration right after that. But Michael, that there was a lot of things going on at the time. And the biggest one in my portfolio was the 2018 midterm elections were coming up, and the Russians were planning to meddle in those midterm elections. we knew that if we left our jobs, and at the time I was going into the job of chief of staff at the Department of Homeland Security, we knew they wanted to replace us with super loyalists and super hardliners. So in that moment, I'm convincing myself, well, why don't I just stay, see through the election, make sure that the Russians don't meddle, and then get out. During that time delay, Trump did extraordinary damage. And if you remember, right after the midterms, he fires his attorney general, fires chief of staff John Kelly, fires defense secretary Jim Mattis effectively. And I get to Christmas, and Brett Stevens from the New York Times wrote an open letter in the paper. Dear Anonymous inside the Trump administration, on the eve of Christmas, basically. And he says in it, you thought what you guys were doing was stabilizing the administration.
I remember that, yes.
At this point, you must know that there's no more good that can be done. And if you stay, you'll risk just becoming one of his flunkies and one of his enablers. And that piece hit me hard. I mean, I told Brett this not long ago. We'd never had the conversation about it. And that's when I realized there wasn't going to be any keeping it in check. The only way to fix it was to go to the outside and oppose it. That's what is happening right now, I think, in the Republican Party, is there are some rational Republicans left trying to fix the GOP. But I think a lot of them need to come to the conclusion that they've got to fully turn against MAGA and burn it down if they're going to save the GOP. There's no kind of flirting with it and being half in and half out. And that's what really alarms me about the Republican presidential race is outside of maybe Chris Christie, the candidates have largely been pretty timid in going against Donald Trump. I mean, after his indictment, you saw, a good number of them come out and essentially parrot the MAGA line that it was a politicized indictment, that it was the, President Joe Biden trying to punish one of his political enemies, ignoring, of course, the fact that Biden had been completely firewalled from this prosecutorial decision against Trump. That's what worries me. And I do think, as you hinted at earlier, that the rational faction of the GOP has really been put down by the radical one pretty incredibly. And it's why in this book, I try to paint a picture of what will happen if a MAGA president retakes the White House, whether it's Trump somehow pulling it off and winning a second term, or any one of these other figures. Because even if it's not Trump, my case I make here is that the GOP base has been so radicalized to the MAGA movement that almost anyone who wins the nomination on the Republican side is going to be beholden to that base and will very likely govern like a MAGA president. In fact, the big think tanks in Washington, D.C., Heritage Foundation and America First Policy Institute, plan to staff up the next GOP administration largely with Trump holdovers. And so that administration will look a lot like a second Trump term, even if the ex-president isn't at the helm. And I'll just say that the conversations I had surprised even me. I mean, I arrogantly thought, okay, I know what would happen in a second Trump administration. I lived it. It's going to be bad. If you think it's going to be bad, it's going to be so much worse than you think. As part of this 2-year effort for this book, I interviewed dozens and dozens of ex-officials to ask what would happen in their portfolios. And it blew my mind. It absolutely blew my mind.
So let's get a little deeper then into those conversations, which is at the heart of Blowback, where you are talking with and about MAGA officials who, for example, former advisors, are predicting a civil war. They're predicting, a second administration, and to your point, even someone who is not necessarily Trump, but who is, burrowed into that truth, will be using that term, their term, as a revenge. I mean, Trump himself has already come out and said to his base, "I am your retribution. That's the only reason you need to elect me. I'm the guy who's going to go kick ass. I'm not even bother taking names. All right, I'm just going to go kick ass." How does in Blowback, how do you walk us through, and, well, more importantly, set up that conversation, but then walk us through these various scenarios that impact on national security, impact on constitutional principles and norms, agencies like DOJ and FBI that are right now in the crosshairs, not just of Trump, but Kevin McCarthy and Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Yeah, I mean, Michael, one of the more alarming anecdotes that I was told in Blowback was when I spoke to intelligence officials. I spoke to a whole range of people, from John Bolton, who had been Trump's national security advisor, to Sue Gordon, who'd been deputy director of national intelligence, down to spies at departments and agencies who are still in government, up and down the ladder. And one of the things that really surprised me was an individual who'd worked on Trump's NSC, his National Security Council, forecast that he felt like a second term would be a revenge machine. And specifically, his worry was that Trump appointees in the second administration or another MAGA White House would go and pull FISAs against the president's enemies. So for those who aren't familiar, FISA is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And the person got into a great bit of detail with me about how they thought that would be done. But the top line suggestion here is that in a second term, the Trump administration would essentially go wiretap political enemies. I mean, this is like Nixon on steroids. And when I first got that comment, I thought, okay, maybe that's a little outlandish.
Don't they have to have a basis for that? I mean, the FISA court is just going to give you a wiretap without well, at least that's what it says on paper. They're not going to do that.
Well, and those are exactly the conversations I had with folks. Is they pointed out at the end of the Trump administration, they were aggressively trying to staff up the intelligence agencies with their officials, including putting a top White House Trump lawyer in at the National Security Agency, including sending people into CIA and elsewhere, that in a second term, they'll essentially stack those agencies with people who can execute those warrants without court oversight. I mean, that blew my mind that serious people, some of whom are still in these intelligence community jobs, are forecasting that Trump would try to use intel powers against his adversaries. One person, Fiona Hill, who had been Trump's advisor on Russia at the White House, Fiona Hill said to me she was very worried about the intelligence community being politicized in another term. And her comment was, it will lead the United States into wars, because what she saw before she left was a concerted effort on behalf of the White House to start manipulating intelligence towards the president's worldview, which would make a future administration blind towards the real threats. And that's something Trump was trying to do in the end. And next time, they're very focused on making sure political actors who are loyal to the president staff the intelligence community instead of the Republicans that had served in the Bush administration or on Capitol Hill.
We're having a conversation with my man Miles Taylor and his new book, Blowback. Folks, you thought Anonymous was hot. Oh my goodness, this boy is writing truth, and he's putting up warning flags and flares. When we come back, we're going to get into a little bit more of what Blowback is sharing and telling us about a second Trump term, but also about, even before we get to that, what this upcoming election could potentially look like, as well, as we double down with my man Miles Taylor right after this. Welcome back, everybody, to Michael Steele Podcast, and it's time to have a little blowback. Get into it with Miles Taylor, the author of the new book. There it is, 1-2, baby. We're excited to have Miles with us as he releases Blowback, a warning to save democracy from the next Trump. And it's out now, and we're excited about that. So let's talk a little bit about one aspect of this, the setup for this upcoming campaign. A big component, we see it play out with a number of these candidates, particularly guys like DeSantis, around this culture war narrative, where, the primary legislative agenda, not so much at the federal level, but what we've seen so far at the state levels, has been about guns, gays, and girls, right? Talk to us about that. Talk to us about this agenda that is sort of really setting in motion what the ultimate game plan is going to be going into 24 against Joe Biden and the Democrats.
Well, this goes back in time, Michael, and I'm going to make it personal by bringing you into the equation, which is when you were chairman of the Republican National Committee, and I was just a little baby Bushy. I just left the Bush administration, climbing my way up the Washington career ladder. You painted a picture of a Republican Party that was not fanatically obsessed with the culture wars. And to be blunter, millennials like me don't give a fuck about social issues.
Right.
I was a fiscal conservative. I'm probably more libertarian than you. I mean, I don't know.
Right.
I want government tiny, tiny, tiny out of my life. I'm a super libertarian. And liberals are always surprised to find that out. They're like, but you oppose Trump. I'm like, yeah, but you're not going to get along with me because I'm a hardcore libertarian. But we share a common cause against going against political extremism. But what happened during the Trump years is we saw the culture wars come back like a zombie. And now it's overtaken the GOP. And that quote you cited was something that I could not get out of my mind. I sat down, I interviewed someone who'd been one of Trump's top political operatives. And I thought we were going to talk about the legislative branch. And I said, look, what do you think the agenda of the next Trump White House or next MAGA White House would be towards Congress? And without missing a beat, this person who's got a Southern accent said, it's going to be guns, gays, and girls. Guns, gays, and girls was how the person summed up the domestic policy agenda on Capitol Hill for the next Trump. Let's break that down. The three biggest priorities being guns, stripping anything having to do with gun laws and safety protections so that it's an unfettered Second Amendment. Gays, rolling back any protections for the LGBTQ community, and especially a focus on reversing the Supreme Court's authorization of gay marriage. And then girls. And this individual, I asked, I was like, well, what do you mean by girls? And he pointed to abortion. He said, look, they're going to try to make sure that there's a full-on federal ban against abortion. After the Supreme Court's decision, of course, states on a case-by-case basis have made it impossible to get an abortion. I think it's 11 states where it's now effectively outlawed. But the priority will be to force that through Congress. The individual said, they'll get rid of the filibuster in the Senate to make it happen. They'll cajole lawmakers in the House. They'll use any vehicle, including spending decisions. We all know at the end of every year, Congress has got to pass a budget to keep the government running. They'll put that gun to the head of the federal government and shut the government down to get these things passed. But I was most jarred by how far the Republican Party has fallen from that period where you were chairman. And it was like, look, we're going to move beyond social issues and really try to have an honest conversation about the role of government in society, to reverting all the way back to repression. There was another person I spoke to, Gavin Smith. He was one of the very few openly gay appointees in the Trump administration. And we had a pretty emotional conversation. He sat down with me and he said, look, I was so convinced going into the Trump administration that he didn't give a shit about turning back the clock on gay rights. In fact, Trump made very clear he had gays on his staff. It didn't matter. He was going to be progressive on those issues. And he said, I couldn't have been more wrong. He completely turned back the clock. And now the MAGA movement is attacking LGBTQ rights to the point that, I'm being told it's going to be on the top 3 items on the next Trump's legislative agenda. I think that's pretty alarming.
Yeah, the idea of the gun thing is very clear, and that will not be a heavy lift at all. Should they have the White House, the Senate, and the House to basically weaken state laws that right now govern a lot of those actions from the federal perch, to allow, as we've seen in many states, unfettered access, unlicensed access in many cases to guns. The gays piece, I've said from the moment the Supreme Court affirmed gay marriage, that was something that was going to stick in the craw for social conservatives, and if ever given the power, they would reverse it. So look for gay marriage to go away. It is part of the unspoken public agenda, if you will, for a lot of these folks. And the abortion issue, I don't understand how people never understood that this idea that a party that fought as hard as it did to defeat Roe versus Wade would stop once Roe versus Wade was defeated. And the idea is, as Lindsey Graham very clearly made known, has never been about giving this power to the states. It has always been about enforcing that power with federal mandates, and making sure that I think it starts, here's the narrative. I think it starts with a 6-week ban, 6-week federal ban, and that will ultimately get changed to an absolute outright ban, because you have to. These folks aren't going to compromise on this issue. Why would they? Particularly since they figure that they've won the battle. The remaining aspects of the war still need to play out because abortion is still allowed. And you're not going to find, rationalization from people who take the position that under no circumstances, whether it's the life of the mother or rape or incest, that abortion is okay. What makes you then think that they're going to say, okay, that's all okay for up to 6 weeks? No, they're not. So the country needs to be prepared for that. And I think a lot of the warning shots that you kind of provide in the book are things that people now have to reimagine and rethink how the country's going to deal with that. Look, the Kansas vote in the summer of 20, shocked the system on the right because they didn't think Republican women would turn on them. They continue to miscalculate where Republican women who are looking at their daughters and their granddaughters will ultimately align on this. So that's the tension. The question is whether or not that tension is going to be great enough to offset what you describe, in the book and throughout the book, as this sort of retributive cleansing, getting it right this time, having learned from 2016 to 2020, and now perfecting the absolute unfettered control of the federal government over every aspect of one's life.
Well, and Michael,
from the party that was always against those things.
If I had hopped in a DeLorean and come into this moment 7 years ago, I would have said, Miles has lost his fucking mind and Michael Steele's off the reservation. Like these things sound so outlandish. It sounds like the sky is falling, but it's all very real. I mean, right. Some of the people that I spoke to for this book are still in Trump's orbit. Some of these are advisors still to Donald Trump that are saying this is what the priority will be. It is that bad. The sky, in a democratic sense, is falling if we make this mistake again. There was another one that really, just in its pure cruelness, caught me off guard, and that was a friend of ours, Josh Venable, who had been chief of staff at the Department of Education, told me about how there was a plan on the table in a second term to kick all immigrant kids out of schools in the United States. Any kid who came here with an undocumented parent. And the plan, he called it, quote, a cockroach that wouldn't die.
Wow.
Is that they wanted to take education dollars from the U.S. Department of Education and basically say to every school district, we're going to take your money away if you don't kick these immigrant kids out of your schools. And
so what do they think happens to those kids when they do that? So let's finish that scenario. All right. So you've now kicked a 16-year-old male Hispanic out of high school. What do you think that brother's going to do? Because the first thing that pops to my mind is now I've unleashed him on a community that he's going to be angry with. So now I've got to worry about his criminal activity. I've got to worry about his anti-societal activities. What do you think happens when you frustrate the purposes of someone, regardless of how they got here? You frustrate their purpose. What do you think they're going to do? I mean, you think, oh, so now you've kicked this kid out of a high school that he's a school system that he's been in since he was a baby, coming here with his parents, right? that he's now going to go, oh, I'm just going to go back to where my parents came from. I get it. My bad. I should have known better. I'm leaving. I don't.
Well,
Did anybody ever ask that question?
this is where it gets really sick. Is one, they want to do that to punish immigrant families here in the United States. But two, what's even sicker about it is there's this desire to create instability in what are perceived to be left-leaning communities and sanctuary cities in the United States. And this is something else that in the course of writing this, I discovered, which is the things that even Trump decided not to do in a first term are the things his acolytes are now bringing to fruition. Yeah. And one of those was this idea of busing and dumping migrants in democratic sanctuary cities to create instability, to overwhelm social services. And at the time, when I was in the administration, Trump called us and he said, literally, verbatim, I want you to send the rapists and the murderers from the border into democratic cities to create instability. And he wanted to, quote, bus and dump migrants from the border in these places, because he wanted to say to democratic states, you know, look at this mess. The migrants are yours. We told Donald Trump that was illegal, not a bad idea, not immoral. It was both of those things, but that it was illegal to use federal dollars to go punish states for political reasons by using migrants as pawns. Donald Trump begrudgingly ceded to that, and he didn't do the idea. Guess who has carried it forward with alacrity? Ron DeSantis in Florida. Is after the Trump administration, he said, okay, well, I'll do that.
So Texas, what do you think Ron DeSantis' response would be if the governors of New York and California, let's just take New York because that's where he sent a lot of them, the governor of New York and the mayor of Washington, D.C., because I serve on the Catholic Charities Board here in Washington, and we're dealing with this issue of, you know, migrants coming to the nation's capital, being sent to the nation's capital. And we're doing it in the way that our Lord Jesus Christ asked us to do, right? Take care of those in need, and you know, it'll work out. But the political side of my brain goes, well, shit, if I'm the mayor of DC, I'm like, or the governor of New York, I'm like, oh, you want to play? Well, I tell you what, I'm going to round up a lot of my homeless. Since you've now freed up resources in your state and put an additional strain on mine, I'm going to share the love, baby. I'm going to ship my homeless guys and gals who've been living on the streets of my city for the last 5 or 6 years, whatever. I'm going to give them a free bus ride to Florida because it's warmer and the people are nice, right? I mean, what do you think his reaction would be? The first thing he would scream would be exactly the point you made to the president. This is illegal. You cannot do this. You cannot bus U.S. citizens from one state to another like that or whatever. You cannot deprive them of the rights. Well, guess what? Our Constitution attaches to migrants as well, right? And I've never understood why no one has made the case in such a way that pushes back against these anti-democratic behavior. These mayors and governors is like, okay, we'll take them and we're going to bitch into our press corps about it, but okay. And the next busload shows up. So I think one of the things about what I like about your book is you talk about these situations in a way in which you seemingly say, hey, you don't need to do it. You don't need to accept this. Don't accept this. Fight back against this. Push back against this. It was the basis of Anonymous. It is the basis, it's an important and a critical basis for avoiding Trump 2.0, either in Trump or in a Ron DeSantis or someone else. And I just don't understand why that part of this equation is so hard, Miles. I mean, and you're talking to these people, why do we seem so helpless and feckless in shutting this shit down?
Well, I'm going to say something that is deeply ironic coming from me, which is that my assessment after the 2 years of writing this thing is that the single biggest threat to our democracy is anonymity. Now, let me be a little bit more specific. Yes, interpersonally, I regret not having unmasked myself sooner, but interview after interview, I came to the conclusion that the only reason we are still in this situation is because people in the most important moments of decision didn't speak up. They decided to remain anonymous. And there is a phenomenon in psychology, and I'm not going to be able to think of the name of it right now, but it's casually known as the bystander phenomenon. And we've all seen this in the news before. Someone's getting beat up on the subway in New York, and it's a crowded subway train, and they all watch it happen. And then the person gets killed. And then there's a news story. Why didn't people do anything? Well, when someone's getting attacked, when something bad has happened, it's often, unfortunately, human nature to assume someone else will act.
Mm-hmm.
And that collective assumption leads to collective inaction. It's only when someone has the courage to push through that impulse and actually do something does it make it easier for others to follow suit. So that guy getting beaten up in the subway, if someone comes out to try to stop the attacker, it makes it easier for another and another and another to join and stop the bad thing from happening. We are witnessing collective anonymity in our political system right now, where people who know better at the highest levels are still refusing to speak up. Now, specifically, I'm really pointing my finger at my former party, at the Republican Party. The people who are leading the GOP right now, Kevin McCarthy, as Speaker of the House, sat in meetings with me in 2015 and 2016, where he thought Donald Trump was a doofus, dangerous to the Republican Party. And now here he is still helping that man be the figurehead of the Republican Party. He is still lying because it's politically convenient for him and it's allowed him to ascend to power. That's what we have to do, is we have to get people to unmask themselves and say the things that they say to people like you and me, Michael, in private. I mean, you and I still talk to a lot of these elected Republicans. You know, we'll go out to beers with these people who will say, it's so much worse than it looks. Well, okay, time for you to go tell your constituents that. I mean,
Right.
I'm not trying to call people out in this book who wanted me to protect their identities, but ironically, there's a bunch of people who wanted to remain anonymous that I talked to in this book, sitting Republicans. And I would end those interviews and say, yes, I will protect your identity, but maybe consider letting me use it on the record, because now's kind of the moment to speak up. That was immensely disappointing.
Their self-preservation more than they value the truth of the moment, the truth that they've just expressed to you. They value the fact that I've got an election coming up and I want to get reelected to a job that is killing me inside, that I'm dying every day in. I value that more than sacrificing that job for the greater truth, for the greater good. And I personally have a hard time with that, because my life, the way I was raised, was always been, you make that sacrifice. You just do. Now, maybe it has something to do with having been an Augustinian seminarian and raised by a mother who impressed upon me every day the sacrifices I must make. But it just seems to me, and a friend of mine and I, we had lunch recently, and that question came up in a different form, Miles, which was, you know, basically, what are you willing to risk to make it all stop? What are you willing to risk to move us off of this trajectory? How much do you love the country? Do you love the country more than you love your title, your position? My short answer to her was, no, they don't. They don't love the country more. In fact, they blame the country that they don't have more. And they blame their neighbors and even some of their own family members that they don't have more. They want more. They feel entitled to more. And I think when I look at the African-American experience in the country, and I'm like, well, after 400 years, talk about entitlement. And yet we didn't go try to burn down the Capitol and hang the vice president of the United States. I mean, really? And yet some white folks get their shit all mixed up and confused by some two-bit, hawking, political salesman. And they're willing to go strip down 250 years of experimental democracy. And over what? Because they think what? And they love what? They want what? And those questions to me are really the essence going into 2024, which is why I think Blowback is such an important story for folks to sort of latch on to, because it's going to raise for you, hopefully, answers to those questions. And are you really ready to stop what you see coming? If you see the train coming and you actually had the wherewithal to get on that train to stop it, would you?
Well, there's something, Michael, I talked to you about some time ago, and you made a really good point, is we were talking about political intimidation and violence and how that's become a factor inside the Republican Party. And you said something to me basically to the effect of, intimidation works. And they sent a message by punishing Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger as hard as they did. Literally, death threats galore to those folks. I've experienced it. They've had waterfalls of threats, and that intimidation has silenced others. But, I had a conversation with Adam Kinzinger about this, and it was interesting. We talked about the threats, and Adam said, yeah, I think a lot of my colleagues who know better, which in his view was the majority of them, weren't coming forward because they saw what happened to people like he and Liz Cheney. But then he said something that surprised me. He said, but you know what? I think there's something even bigger than that. There's something they're even more afraid of. And I said, what could they be more afraid of than death? And his response was getting kicked out of the tribe.
Yep.
They're more afraid of getting kicked out of the tribe than death. And you know what it made me think of? It made me think of this great Jerry Seinfeld stand-up routine where Jerry Seinfeld, this is from maybe 30 years ago, he goes up there and he says, that a survey had come out, and this was true, that a national survey had come out, and it found that the number one fear Americans had was public speaking. And their number two fear was death. And so the quip he made was, so an American would rather be in the casket than delivering the eulogy.
Right.
And that's how I think of Republicans right now. They would rather be in the casket than going and speaking out and telling the truth about what we're experiencing. If we want to fix this, what we've got to do is lower that price of dissent. So it's more Republicans coming out, like what Chris Christie's doing, and Asa Hutchinson and Will Hurd in the Republican primary, but also GOP voters coming out and having the courage to say in their communities, enough is enough. This guy's a lunatic. We've got to move on. It lowers the cost for everyone else. It makes a difference.
The author, the man, Mr. Anonymous himself, Miles Taylor, the new book, Blowback, A Warning to Save Democracy from the Next Trump, is out now. Miles, I'm excited for you. I'm more importantly excited for, given everything that you've been through, and you have graciously shared some of that journey with me over the short time that we've come to know each other, and I appreciate that. But what I take away more than anything is a level of conscious bravery in the face of unrelenting hatred and fear. And you are again showing people, look, it doesn't have to be this way. And yeah, it's hard. And sometimes it's scary. But what do you love? What do you value? What means more? And the country should, because without it, all the stuff that you're fighting about just goes away, right? At the end of the day. And you did that in the great work with Anonymous, and now with your new effort to remind us of why these things are important and why we should value them. I appreciate you, brother.
Well, my mentor, Master Yoda, who's taught me a lot of what I know, really thank you. And I hope people keep listening to the Michael Steele podcast. I'll say it 7 ways to Sunday. You're the type of person that we need in the Oval Office. So I'm going to keep begging you to run for president of the United States. We need you.
They couldn't handle me as RNC chairman. I don't know about the rest of it, but I appreciate you, brother. Again, follow Miles on Twitter at Miles Taylor USA. The book is Blowback: A Warning to Save Democracy from the Next Trump. And check it out, folks. I think you're going to find it more than just a good read. So that does it for our time together now. I really appreciate you all for taking time to be with us. Follow me on Twitter at Michael Steele. Follow the podcast at Steele_podcast. Do that download thing, because you know I love it when you do, because it's the best kind of voodoo. And until next time, take care of yourselves. Enjoy the summer. And we'll catch up with you in a few days. Later.